Welcome to the Autism in Black podcast, where we focus on all things autism and the Black parent experience. Our goal is to always educate, support, and empower parents to advocate for not only their children, but themselves. Hello, and welcome to the Autism in Black podcast. I'm Maria Davis-Pierre, a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida and America's #1 autism advocate for Black parents. I am the founder and CEO of Autism in Black, Inc., where we aim to include the excluded. Today we have Jen White Johnson, who is a designer, photographer, art activist, and art educator. Currently, she teaches as an assistant professor of visual communication at Bowie State University. Her work focuses on the intersection of content and caregiving with an emphasis on redesigning ableist visual culture. When her son was diagnosed as autistic at age 2, she began to examine the absence of Black disabled children in digital and literary media. This motivated the release of an advocacy photo line entitled Knox Rocks, dedicated to her autistic son as a way to give visibility to children of color in the Black autistic community. Since its release, the line has received national and international recognition, including features in Afropunk, the 2019 Women's March on Washington, and is permanently archived in libraries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. She holds an MFA in graphic design from the Maryland Institute College of Art and a BA in visual arts from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm really excited having Jen on the show to have such an important deep conversation that we rarely get to be privy to. We talk about many things: raising a child when you're dealing with your own disability, different forms of ableism and the impact of ableism, and many other things. So I hope you enjoy today's show. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Autism in Black podcast. I have a very special guest here today. Today I have Jen White Johnson. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very great. I'm exhausted, but I'm so happy to be here with you.
I can completely understand being exhausted, right? Especially now during these times and everything that's going on. It is, different right now.
Yeah, like just the way that we're balancing life during this pandemic. And, a lot of disabled folks have lived in isolation, and some, have been asking for accommodations to be made. But then there's also the notion of, keeping up with relationships and making sure that you can still feel like you're being connected with the world and with everybody. And so, everyone continues to stay connected in their own ways. But I also feel as Black women, we're expected to just keep going, keep making it work, like keep up the balance. And there are times where it can get a little heavy, and we feel like we're just being weighted with a lot as Black moms.
That's so important. So important. So I have read your bio, but can you tell us more about yourself and your story?
Sure. Yeah. So first I'm Afro-Latina. My dad is Black. He's from the south side of Chicago, and my mom was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico. So I grew up in a very beautiful, colorful, multiracial, multicultural home. And I grew up speaking English and Spanish. So I'm bilingual. So I really have a really interesting, kind of very mixed upbringing in terms of just culture and food and just stories. And so it's a lot. I never really felt like I was one or the other growing up. And both of my parents were, 9-to-5ers, boomers. And I was a latchkey kid. I would come home to an empty house sometimes. And I had an older brother and an older sister, but they were very much, kind of like in their own world. And so I would often play alone and kind of, create my own little worlds and do a lot of artistic crafting and things like that my parents would kind of encourage me to do because they were also Sunday school teachers. So there was a lot of art making, a lot of singing, a lot of playtime in my home on the weekends, often when during the busy work schedule when we were always running around at church and kind of, being in service to other folks. And so watching them, do ministry in the church and watching them, serve other folks and specifically the elderly community, and then also, teach in the church really just gave me the drive to be a service work and to care for others and to service others with my gifts. So I am a teacher. I'm an art educator at Bowie State University, and I teach art and design to a variety of different amazing students that come from all over the United States, and some of them are local in Maryland, which is where it's actually the oldest HBCU in Maryland. So so teaching has been a huge part of who I am as a person, and care work and education go hand in hand for me, because you're really, as an educator, you're really helping to preserve, so much heritage and so much access and so much history in terms of what, our kids and what our students are learning and what they're examining, in terms of their own culture. So yeah, and I also have undiagnosed ADHD, and it's something that I've learned to accept, and I've learned to balance, and something that I've learned to watch very closely in terms of how I navigate in this world. Especially, I've only been a mom for 8 years, and it's really, I've had to deal with a lot of interesting, disability issues in terms of executive functioning and brain fog and chronic fatigue.
Yes.
A lot of that is brought on by needing to balance so much more than I was like in grad school. And I also have Graves' disease. It's genetic condition, specifically in my case, because my mother does have thyroid disease. And so it was just passed along to me. And I first had symptoms in high school. And there's a variety of different thyroid disorders. So there's, Graves' disease, and there's Hashimoto's disease. And so when your thyroid is overactive, you have to get treatment. Some folks get surgery. Some folks get a radioactive iodine treatment. And that was the treatment that I received when I was only 21. That shrinks the thyroid. And so I'm a young woman. My body is still experimenting and with hormonal challenges and differences.
Yeah.
And so at that time I had to, to really balance like my activities and my diet, and then also medication to kind of help my body work the way that it's supposed to, obviously, because when you take a hormone replacement therapy drug, like that just plays like a serious whirlwind on like your everyday, balance in terms of like what you're doing. And it affects your energy, and it affects, all sorts of aspects of like your daily life. And so I've really been navigating with not having a fully functioning thyroid and having to take a thyroid replacement, which means that I have to work harder to make sure that my body is like doing what it needs to do every day.
Yeah. And when you're dealing with your own, diagnosis, how did you deal with that with then having a child who is autistic?
Yeah. So it was a very traumatic birthing experience for me anyway, because I had hypertension and I had preeclampsia when he was born. And these were things that really weren't brought to light until I was already in my third trimester. So he was born 2 pounds, 15 ounces. He was really tiny, micro preemie. And so that in itself brought on a lot of, stress and anxiety and post-traumatic stress. So I was already dealing with mothering and dealing with that post-traumatic stress anyways. So when he was diagnosed as autistic, I was like, okay, wow, like this is going to be really interesting. But because he was 2.5 going on 3 years old when he had received his initial diagnosis. And then when he was 3, we got him into a really amazing center where he was able to, have other autistic friends and be around, other autistic educators and receive, speech therapy and behavioral therapy, and just have a really cool blast, like just coming into his own. But it was a really interesting time because, at first we were, obviously when your Black child is diagnosed as autistic, the world, a lot of Black families are like, oh, the world is falling and my child is never going to be accepted and he's broken and he needs to be fixed. What do we need to do to like make him normal? Like that's like the initial response that a lot of people expect for you to have. Or they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, and let me know if there's anything that we can do. And immediately thinking that, oh, there's something gravely wrong with your child, or it's something that you did to cause this, or just people who were ignorant and uneducated and who don't really understand about like each family's story. So I don't know. I mean, we had spent so much time, and when I say we, I mean like my immediate family, like my parents, my in-laws, my husband. We had already spent so much time falling in love with my son because he was premature. So when he was diagnosed, we didn't necessarily think like, oh my God, like on top of being premature, he's autistic. That's it. Like, he's not like a child that we want to have. No, it was the exact opposite. We were like, no, this is we're just going to keep doing what we have been doing, loving him, uplifting him, making sure he's healthy, making sure that he feels okay to like be himself. And I mean, because he was already doing so many amazing things at the time that he was diagnosed. Like, he was already a very joyful, he wasn't really communicating. He was communicating like on his own terms. He was speaking, so he is a speaking autistic kid, but he had his own unique ways of conversing with us and seeing the world. Like, he, of course, he scripted a lot, and a lot of like echolalia and echoing different things that we were saying, but he was soaking in a lot Dr. Seuss, and he would speak to us in like Dr. Seuss lingo, and like the world was like a huge storybook, and where we were all characters. And so we were already so in love with just who he was. And so I mean, sure, it was a lot to balance, but I slowed down a lot. I mean, it allowed for me to really just focus on, all right, like, sure, because at that time I was teaching and I was busy and I was running around a lot, but it really gave me the opportunity to just stop everything that I felt just really didn't matter and focus on, making sure that he had everything that he needed. And I mean, and now he's 8. He'll be 8 in October, and it's just been like, it's been phenomenal. I mean, because we're buddies. Like, that's my best friend. Like, he's my buddy, and he's taught me so much about myself. And I know that that's like corny, and you hear all moms say that, but
it's not. It's definitely, your experience is so similar to mine. I was eclamptic and went into just for a regular appointment, and ended up going into, having to have her emergency C-section. And it, I just was so not ready. I was like, okay, she was a month early. I'm like, I need this time, but again, Pierre babies are big babies over here. So she was on the verge of almost 8 pounds. So she was preemie by age and not by size. And I think that also, came with its own issues. And then, getting her diagnosis, and the same with us, we weren't like, oh my God, the world is ending. It was like, okay, well, how do we now add that into being a Black little girl for us? That was our experience. So, and then me being, having diagnosed ADHD, and my husband is undiagnosed ADHD for sure. Trying to navigate that. And it was just like, okay. And then I think for us, when I had my twins, that's when it was like, okay, yeah, you're going to have to do something about your own ADHD, because this is not the business what we're dealing with right now. But it's so many similarities. And she's 8. She just turned 8 in June. So, it's fun to see them, progress and grow and be their own little people.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, we can try to infiltrate and we can try to put so many demands on them, but they're going to be their own, like they're their own person. And yeah, they'll have little traces of you and they'll have little traces of your husband but still, like they're going to be their own person. Like they have their own identity and their own way of expressing the things that make them happy, joyful, angry, upset. And we just have to sit back and just say, okay, like you're you. And
yeah. And I know my family definitely thinks I'm weird, because I always, ask my kids, get their input, and see how, they want something, because it is their life, and their opinion matters, and I'm like, yeah, they're kids, but they still are people.
Exactly. Yes, they are people, and we want them to be those people. And they're going to learn from us. I mean, they're, especially with autistic kids, like they absorb so much. They're very observant and they pay attention. They do. And what you say is what you say. And if you say something different, they're like, but I thought you said, but you said, and
yeah, getting called out all the time.
And so we're at that point now where we have to be mindful of like what we say, how we present, a situation, how we include them, how we, uplift them, because word is bond. Like they're soaking it all up. They're soaking it all up.
They are. So I also know that a part of your work that you do is on the intersection of content and caregiving and surrounding around ableism. Can you, talk about that and explain for the audience members who don't know what ableism is and, how you integrate that into your work?
Sure. I mean, ableism is just horrendous, because it's basically, it's like devaluation of disabled people. It's discrimination. It's like infantilizing a disabled person. It's being afraid to use the word disability or disabled like in your conversation. So you'll hear a lot of folks say differently abled, or they're just different, or they and even sometimes like I'll say, oh, like, well, my son learns differently from you. He has his own style of learning. But we're also very mindful and conscious of, it's okay for him to tell other people that he's autistic, and that he has a disability, and making sure that the community that he's around like uplifts him, and they don't necessarily infantilize him or maybe count certain elements of his disability as laziness, or he's crazy, or he's so hyper, and he's this, and we get that a lot, right? Like as ADHD folks, like I spend so much time trying to mask, and that's why I was like, look, if I'm going to spend so much time trying to create this content that uplifts the community and that's not ableist with its particular language, then I need to be able to like really accept certain elements about myself, so that my son and we can have like continue this bond of mothering and kid, but then understand that we're cut from the same cloth in a way, and that we can speak each other's language. And so I needed to be able to tell myself, like, look, disability isn't a bad word. And I'm sure you've heard that, like, disability isn't a dirty word.
Yeah.
The minute that we try to tell, please, like the conversation within the Black community, oh my goodness, like there are so many people who feel like they have to mask, or they can't use the word disability because they're really uncomfortable with like the connotations, right?
Yeah.
because of the way that media portrays it, or the way that our own communities or our own culture portrays it. It's like, disabled folks were kind of like, at the back end of the conversation. Our issues aren't always necessarily brought to the forefront. We're paid less economically, like we're disenfranchised, we're devalued, we're not really rallied, we're not really amplified. They talk about us when we're gone. That's one thing that a lot of the content that I've been creating has been really heavy for me, because I'm uplifting these names of, Sandra Bland and Stefan Watts, and folks who had, neurodivergence or who had disabilities, but no one ever really spoke about them, and they weren't necessarily uplifted, before they were gone. And so, and then even like the students that I work with, because like I have a few students who are autistic or who have ADHD, who have like a variety of different learning disabilities or cognitive disabilities. And oftentimes other professors will say, hey, like, what can I do for this one particular student? Because they do this, they do this, they do this, they do that. And it's like all of this very like intentional ableist language, like, well, I think that they complain too much, or they're lazy, and I don't need to make all these accommodations for them, or how do I make these accommodations? And it's not my responsibility. And they're, and certain aspects of the accommodations aren't always necessarily up to the professor, but I also feel like the professor and the student can have really honest conversations about, okay, well, what kind of accommodations do you need? Because I don't want to, like, as a professor, I don't want to necessarily think that the student are all these things that they're not, you know what I mean? And so those are a lot of the conversations that I have with other faculty. And then, also disability support services on different campuses. Like, if they really encourage students to like practice self-advocacy and to like, not necessarily be afraid to tell professors like, look, like these are the challenges that I'm dealing with, I need support, and these are the supports that I need. It will really help to like eradicate, or at least help shift like a lot of ableism.
Yeah, especially with, ADHD in our community, because, that one is so hard to accept for a lot of Black people, because they're like, it just means your child's bad. Your child's bad. It's just what it is. They don't have ADHD. That's not real. They can focus. You just beat it into them. And then when we're having to deal with all of these stigmas within, trying to get through school, and then we get to college, and it's like, okay, because as we age, a lot of our characteristics of our diagnosis become more prominent. And, it's difficult, because as I was aging, it was definitely difficult in, undergrad, then in my master's. And then when I was in the PhD program, I couldn't even focus at all to even finish the dissertation at that point, so it is so important for professors to understand accommodations come for a reason.
Yes. Yeah. Accommodations. And then it wasn't until January that of this past year that I was more comfortable like telling students like, look, like this is who I am, and this is how I process information. This is how I express information. And that I was comfortable, but then I was also scared, because I was like, right, the stigma of what? Like my professor, like, oh my God, like, no, she's supposed to be the end all be all. And, she's supposed to, but the more that I uncover and the more transparent I am, like I always have like students that will come up, like, I really appreciate like you being open with us. Thank you so much. Like I also have ADHD, or my brother, or my mom, and I'm like, man, all I had to do was be vulnerable, be honest, be true, be real. And especially now through COVID, I mean, please, like, we have to let it all go. Like, it ain't no time to mask. There's no time. Like, if we're coming into this fight, we have to come with our full selves. And we have to let people know, look, like, this is who I am. And then it also leaves room for really just you know, soulful conversation and real true conversation, because accommodations, you know, just that's accommodation in general is just like a really cool thing because folks are feeling like, yes, like I can actually exist and have purpose because folks are thinking about the supports that I need so that I can be successful.
And it's so difficult to mask. And I don't think people understand what masking is when it's, you know, ADHD. It is I have burnout all the time, you know, and then on top of it, you know, for me, what it was is I didn't want to take the spotlight, you know, away from the purpose and the platform of what I do. But I'm seeing that a lot of us as parents, especially Black parents, have our own diagnosis that we're trying to deal with on top of navigating and teaching our children how to advocate for themselves. And it's so important to be honest with our own truths so that our children can see that.
Yes, completely. Yeah. And then they can just feel like, well, mommy like accepts me. So that's why, you know, a lot of the artwork that I create, like I infuse all of those narratives, you know, because essentially like I'm really trying to just preserve, you know, the beauty of Black neurodivergence, and I'm trying to represent it in a very respectable way. So a lot of my artwork is meant to create just a framework, like almost like a toolkit. It's like, okay, if you're looking for Black representation and in the autistic community for Black folks, here is art, here's some design, here are graphics that can be seen, that can be used to say, hey, like this is like what amplifies the community. And it's so great to see the like some of like my artwork being, you know, archived in libraries and institutions that don't always have like that type of representation, you know, in them. And that's my favorite. I'm like, look, if the Knox Rocks zine that I wrote and designed, and if it's not going to be reviewed by like Essence magazine or the New York Times, that doesn't matter to me, because if it's archived at an institution, at an educational library, so that kids can have access to it, that teachers, that care workers can have access to it, to say, hey, like, wow, here's like an actual book that I can hold that shows like another Black family, you know, like how autism and how joy can be amplified like this. It was just really important to me to be able to write that.
We don't see it at all, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It took, you know, really having to search and find representation for my child, you know, so she would see, you know, that there's a whole community out there that is just like her, you know, and it's sad that we have to do so much research because, you know, our voices aren't amplified.
Yeah. And that's really what I want to be able to just to continue to see, you know, so podcasts like these, and, you know, where we're continuing to just, you know, create community, because that's really what it is. It's like creating safe spaces so that folks can have access, and that they can listen, and then that they can just feel valued, you know. So the minute that someone says, hey, like, I don't see this, or I don't see that, or I don't see like my community represented, we can say, well, look, like, here's a podcast, here's a book, here's an article, here's like these folks that you can follow. And I think now more than ever, you know, everyone's searching, and everyone, you know, like there's this whole conversation of like allyship, and, you know, white folk being like, well, how can I be a better ally? And then, and it's like, well, we've always been here. Like, you know, we've been around for a while, like, you know, and that's the thing that's been so heavy and hard about all this. It's like, it took tragedy, and it took, you know, various communities and uprising to have, you know, certain folks pay attention, you know. And I mean, and it's no different. I mean, when the civil rights movement, when folks were like hosing down Black bodies, like, and because it was televised, like, that's when, you know, folks were paying attention and realizing, oh man, like, you know, this is not right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we just have to continue to know like our place in all of this. But I think like as Black moms, like it's just, yeah, it's difficult, but then I also feel like as care workers, we're like, man, like sign me up, like
Mm-hmm. Leading the charge.
yeah, you don't got to tell us to like advocate and to be out here fighting for our kids, man.
You have to see me regardless. You will see me.
Exactly. And so that's why we, like I said, knowing our place of power and our place of our place in all this, like, all we want to do is help folk and encourage folk and amplify folk. Like that's just really what this is about.
Yes, I love that. And I know you have a definition in regards to mothering as an act of resistance. Can you tell us, what that means and why it's important?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I'm really inspired by just revolutionary mothers, revolutionary care workers. Fannie Lou Hamer is like a huge like influence on my life as being a very radical, Black activist that was trying to really rally folks to vote, to march, to be out there making their voices heard. And she had, she underwent like forced sterilization because of complications that she had, like reproductive complications that she had. And seeing someone who was so heavy in amplifying the community have to undergo so much trauma to just want to be a mother, she ended up being a mother to so many, like within the community. And so I really feel like advocating for maternal justice is like a huge thing. And when it comes to me, like as an artist, my form of resistance is using my artwork and my design to activate change, to change the social conversation. And to change the social conversation, specifically like asking people, like, we need to have more conversations about acceptance. Like we need to have more conversations, not just about, awareness, like autism awareness. Like we need to be aware that autism exists. It's like, okay, well, what's the next step? Like, you're advocating for what? Like for a cure? No.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're advocating for a community, for the community that already exists, to have support and to have safe spaces so that they can just be like themselves. And making sure that just Black moms, Black neurodivergent kids are just being seen, period, that they're visible, and that they're being valued in that visibility, and they're being respected in that visibility. We don't want to see like the same photos of of the same white kids like being amplified and uplifted, like as if only white kids are autistic. And this is multiple autistic folks around the community that feel the same way, like Black autistics that feel the same way. Because I've spent a lot of my time just listening and observing other Black autistics, and I'm so glad that you had Kayla on the show. And
Love her.
yeah, I mean, I had a chat with her last week. She just called me and we were just talking, and I'm like, oh my God, like, yeah. I mean, it's just so important to be able to uplift those voices, because, clinicians and doctors can, sure, like they can fill in the gaps and tell me all these little things that I want to know. But it's like, but my son, he's going to grow into an autistic adult. Yeah. And those are voices that I want to be infused, like, in my kid's like disability journey, and like it, like in his walk with like his autistic self,
Mm-hmm.
So
and,
yeah,
with the healthcare providers, and me being one, we only know what the textbook says. Mm-hmm. It doesn't apply to real life. And I think that's what gets in the way of a lot of healthcare professionals. It's, oh, well, the textbook says. No, it's especially when you add culture into it, it's so different. And, that's why I am always stressing that healthcare workers really need to listen to the voices of those who, they're working with, because it matters and it makes a difference, because their lived experiences are so different from the textbook.
Right. Yeah. And it continues to shift. And we know that, like, culturally, it's a different conversation, whether, like, in terms of like the neighborhood, the state that they live,
Mm-hmm.
the community that they're actually around, and how they enforce specific policies, and how they're how they're encouraged to practice self advocacy. Because some folks are thinking, oh, okay, well, because like I have this diagnosis, instantly, like, I'm being taught that I have to like assimilate and that I have to comply. Like, some people walk through their entire disability journey thinking that way.
Mm-hmm. Sad and unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's like, like, you mean to tell me that I can be disabled and I can be amplified and uplifted and encouraged to be completely interdependent and to just exist like on my own terms? And yes, like that's what we really need to continue to just amplify,
especially in the Black communities, because we don't have that kind of information, because that information doesn't get to our communities. We have so much misinformation about what disabilities are and what they look like, that it does become extremely scary, because we don't have those resources that the white communities have, and they're always 10, 20 steps ahead when it comes to a lot, because of the stigmas, within and outside of our community. So it's so important, that we continue to be a voice and let, those know what's really going on in our communities.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so true, because it's like, when we think about it, like, I think, like, PTA, like, like those organizations, like in schools, that's like a perfect place to begin. Yes. In terms of, oh, okay, well, I'm a PTA mom, neurodivergent mom. Okay, so what are some resources that I've researched that have amplified my family that I can share with other families, that are about community building and about like self-advocacy, that I can share? And I feel like sometimes parents are afraid to like share very radical, like disability justice-based resources, because they're afraid, oh, like that might be a little too much, for my community, or for the other parents in my school. And it's like, no, it's not too much. Like, it's the types of resources that we can share. Like, why should we be afraid of disability justice? Like, why should we be concerned with those particular like communities, if they're rallying to make sure that we are going to be valued and uplifted?
That's a great point and a great place to start, because I know that's soon, that's the first place I go. I'm on the PTA committee. I'm actually vice president. I'm in there, and I'm like, well, no, let's think about Black people. Let's also think about those who are disabled. That's, and I know they get sick of me saying it, but I'm just like, nope, we got to think about this community. We have to think about these things, because it matters, even in how they have the schedule of when the meeting is. It's so important to say, hey, this is why you don't have, a lot of Black people coming to your meeting. Your meetings are at 8 a.m., for working. So, you have to shift those things and go there and be the voice, because if the PTA committee is all white people, then they're going to go by what they're experiencing, which is completely different from what a lot of us are experiencing.
Yeah, and plus you don't have a lot of those white families that are asking, like, well, where are the Black families? Yeah. Like, not, and so it took COVID for my community, and some of like the Zoom chats that we were having, and because that was one of the things that a lot of parents asked for. They were like, well, we want for our kids to continue seeing each other, and we want for them to continue like forming relationships over the summertime. And so that was one of the last things that we had asked for before the school year ended, was, can we, like, whether it's like a Google Meetup or something, or a pen pal system. And there were families within that meeting that were like, well, what can we do to be better allies? Like, what can we do to like to teach our kid about racism. And I was all up in the chats, like,
like it's my time to shine now.
with like anti-racist resources, anti-ableist resources. And I'm like, look, if you really want to know, like, do the research, because you need to be able to talk, especially if it's like white families that are in predominantly African-American communities. I'm sorry, but you cannot teach your kid to be colorblind. Like, your kid has to be very, very aware of that they're a white kid in a predominantly African-American school, and that there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. And it doesn't start with your kid. It's not your kid's responsibility. It's your responsibility to make sure that your kid, like, is informed, period.
You're preaching the word today.
I'm telling you.
And I'm here for it.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So as we begin to wrap up, I definitely want to spend some time talking about your brand, Autistic Joy, because I love it.
Yeah, and it's not really a brand, more so it's just like a way of living for us. It's like, and I view it as like a cultural call to action.
Mm-hmm.
And someone you should definitely really follow, if you don't already, is Timotheus, TJ Gordon Jr. He wrote a really beautiful essay for the 30th anniversary of the ADA, Black Autistic Joy, which is so a really beautiful collection of essays by various disabled voices in the disability community that was written by Alice Wong, and she features a lot of really amazing disability justice activists. And he wrote an amazing essay on Black Autistic Joy from, a Black autistic perspective, where he's really talking about the erasure of, Black disabled kids, and those are things that, like, I also examine in my work. Amplifying self-advocacy, amplifying the joy, realizing that, being Black and autistic, being Black and neurodivergent doesn't always mean that you're under this weight of oppression. Like, they, and I really wanted to be able to show folks that as a family and that as a community, we're not always under the weight of so much negativity. The media wants to portray us as being these very sad individuals that are undergoing so much. I mean, and it's difficult because that's what we see. We see a lot of violence. We see a lot of, disabled folks being, with Elijah McClain, like, excessive force being used to completely, like, dispose of us. And it's so hard watching it. And then I also feel like if we're able to show, like, the happiness, not sugar-coated or not necessarily erasing a lot of the hardships, but amplifying the joy, amplifying just, and it's difficult to talk about and to grasp the words, but I really, to me, the joy is really about showing folks, like, how happiness can help to preserve our culture, because so there's no excuse, in terms of Black joy should always be something that the community chooses to uphold and uplift, right? And that, I feel like that's one of the things that's really going to help save us and preserve us, because that's why, like, in Black culture, like, funerals is a homegoing, like, it's like we're sad, but, like, our loved one, they're going home, and we're going to see them again, like, like, they're still here with us, because we know how to wail, and we know how to cry, and we know how to fall all over the casket, and trust me, like, we've all been there. But I also feel like, let's celebrate these lives.
Yes.
But what is it going to look like to celebrate them as they're still existing, as they're still with us, as they're still here? And we don't see it enough. And sometimes it only comes up in times of crisis, that we need to be reminded of Black joy, especially, Black autistic joy. And so, it's like, for folks that want to be able to talk about like what they're doing, about, oh, these are the things that I enjoy, these are the things that make me happy, and to see the disability community come together to show those aspects of themselves, like that is what is really going to help to create like that sense of community. So I do that with art. I do that with photography, with the way that I show Knox, and I don't get so bent up trying to show, oh, well, he did this today and it was such a rough day, and this is a picture of him crying. This is
Yeah.
a picture of him crying and huddled over in a corner. No, why I'm not. And some parents feel that those things are helpful,
Mm-hmm.
and that oh, well, I have to show like the reality of the situation so that I can get the supports that I need. And I'm like, no, like you're disrespecting your child,
Yeah.
like especially if it wasn't like posted with consent. And so everything that I share into the media, Knox, he wants to be able to like make friends and have a sense of community. And so a lot of the stuff that I share is with his consent and with like his permission. And because he loves to make friends, and he wants to be able to like to say, hey, like I'm here, like can I be your friend, because that's just who he is. So yeah, it's really just a cultural call to action, like autistic joy. It's like, you know, how can we show Black autistic joy, and then how can we call others to be joyful along with us, and to use whatever gifts they have to help amplify that message.
Perfect. I love that. And you brought up a great point about the consent, because I know I get asked a lot why I don't show Malia a lot. And it's, you know, one, I'm protective of her, and, you know, I don't know if she's going to want to be all over, you know, the Autism in Black platform. You know, when she's older, she may not want to be, you know, have people looking back on those things. So everything that I do post is with her consent, but also it's from the perspective of me as a parent, you know. So I get that a lot, like, oh, show her more. I'm like, oh, if she wants to, then yes. But if she doesn't, you know, and she likes to do her stuff. So she likes to mind her business, as she says. So, you know, I don't have her on the platform a lot, but that is a great point about the consent. And I love that you brought that up.
And you don't, and by no means do you have to, like that's no, like you said, it's no one else's business. Like they're not in your home, they're not a part of your family. Like if they want to see other Black kids, then they can go find some. I don't know. Like that's not your job. But I also feel like when we make those decisions as Black parents, it's also like it's also, and I don't want to say opportunity, because that's a very capitalistic word, but I want to say it's a chance where we can dismantle a lot of unjust stigmas, you know, especially since Black kids are always being used to being seen in a very specific way, especially like in the educational system. Like we were talking about that earlier, like the
Yes.
whole ableist language of that's just a wild child, he's just hyper, he's out of control, and he just can't. And it's like I take certain I use like social media again as like as a platform to educate other folks on, well, this is what Black autistic joy can look like when it's done with respect, and when it's very intentional, and when it has purpose. And we talk a lot about like, right, mothering as an act of resistance, joy as an act of resistance. I've written a lot about that, because he's fighting, he's breaking the stigmas of compliance, of this compliance culture, with his joy, by saying, when you think that I'm down, when you think that I'm necessarily like not at my best, he's at his best. He's at his best because he's just being himself. So yeah, and that's the thing, like, you know, because he's going to continue to grow into an autistic adult, you know, if we can help cultivate like this environment of acceptance and of joy, and, you know, not necessarily like weighing him down with, well, these are the, you know, being honest about, these are the things that you're going to continue to face as like a Black man, but then also letting him know that he can help amplify his community and practice self-advocacy with letting joy and positivity be like at the forefront, you know? It's just important.
So as we wrap up, do you have any resources, advice, or tips for parents and caregivers?
Sure, yeah. Like I mentioned Timotheus earlier, so make sure so it's the Disability Visibility Project. That's Alice Wong's new book that she just released. And as I said, it's a collection of essays, and I can send these it'd be really cool to have some sort of resource list that you can send out to like your listeners. And yeah, I mean, there's so many cool things that are important to amplify, like Crip Camp right now. That so Obama's production company, Barack and Michelle Obama, like, you know, my first family.
Mine too.
They have an entertainment production company called Higher Ground, and their second film that they produced is Crip Camp, and it's a really beautiful documentary about a group of kids who hung out, disabled kids who hung out at Camp Gen Ed in like the upstate Catskills of New York, I think, and at a time when folks with disabilities were like institutionalized. I mean, literally, that they were just being completely ostracized by their community, and there were no access needs because this is pre-ADA. So the documentary really touches and highlights on amazing activists like Judith Heumann, and you know, showing how independent and interdependent living first became amplified like out in California. And you know, even like the Black Panthers were like, you know, feeding all these disabled folks that were like lobbying for accessibility needs, and things like being able to live independently, ramps, access like within their community so that they can move around. But the fact that the documentary exists as a really cool like cultural historical narrative allows for us to continue to have more conversations about, okay, well, what are ways that the ADA needs to continue to like shift and be even more like developed to make sure that Black and Indigenous people of color can still feel like they have the resources on the educational level, on the economic level, on the political level. So it's a film that allows for even more dialogue to be raised when it comes to disabled folks and how we need to continue to be respected and given space. Yeah, so just Leroy Moore, Crip Hop Nation. Like I always want to be able to amplify like other just Black disabled people that are just doing it, that are out there like amplifying communities. There's so much. Carrie Gray and the National Alliance for Multicultural Advocates, they're really huge in terms of, again, like creating virtual programming. They just had a huge 2-day event this past weekend for the ADA called Decolonizing Dreams, where we were able to uplift and amplify historical Black disabled figures, and then also the names of countless Black disabled bodies being lost, and then also bringing in panels to talk about like Black disability trauma and imposter syndrome in the workplace, and what that means for like Black disabled folks.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's a lot. There are so many disability communities that are just like out here. I mean, really like owning it and saying what needs to be said.
Yeah, and we'll have that in the show notes, and also you can watch Crip Camp on Netflix, and I think it's for free somewhere else. I have to see, but I know it's on Netflix for sure, and it's a great documentary. But we'll have all of that, all of the other advocates and those who are, you know, fighting for disability rights. We'll have all of that in the show notes, so you guys can just go there and click on it. Where can the listeners find you?
So I'm very active on social media. So you can find me at Instagram and Twitter at JTKnoxRocks. So that's JTKNOXROXS. And I'm also online, like on the web, where you can look at my work and read a little bit about my story and look at some of the stuff that I do with my students at jenwhitejohnson.com.
Thank you so much, Jen, for being on the show and having this amazing conversation with me. I feel like, we've just sat and had some good girl chat at this point.
I know. I felt like it flew by. It was like one of my shortest, easiest chats. Just because talking to Black moms, seriously, like, it makes me so happy. Like, it's just so, it's just so important, like, to hold space for each other. Like, it's the most uplifting thing that we can do right now. I mean,
I appreciate you and thank you for being on the show. And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Autism in Black podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode. If you haven't done so, make sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can always be notified when a new episode drops. To get the resources shared on today's podcast and the show notes, make sure to go to autisminblack.org/podcast. And be sure to share your takeaways from the show on IG stories and Twitter using our official hashtag AIBpod so that we can find them and share them. And if you want to continue the conversation from today's episode, make sure to join our Autism in Black podcast Facebook community. And please make sure to answer the questions to gain entry. Thank you for listening and joining me this week. Have a good one.